Hello, everybody. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco. I am joined today by Dr. Parenti. He's a tenured professor of economics at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He is the author of 5 books, the latest being Radical Hamilton Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder, published in 2020. And we are here to talk about the lockdown leftists. And Dr. Parenti has an excellent article that was published on the Gray Zone titled How the Organized Left Got COVID Wrong, Learned to Love Lockdowns, and Lost Its Mind in Autopsy. We live in some crazy times, Dr. Parenti. It's great to have you on, though. It's truly an honor. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for the invitation to join you.
So, can you walk us through like the process of how you woke up from this narrative? You said that you at first you were trusting the authorities, trusting a little bit of what the media was saying,
Yeah.
but what made you wake up from this narrative?
Well, in the beginning, I remember it was like late November, early December. I saw of 2019. I saw the first articles in the Guardian about the virus, and there was a lockdown in Wuhan, and a video went around of like people saying we're gonna beat this,
Yeah.
yelling us out their windows, like this chant. And I remember sharing that with a friend and thinking nothing of it. And then um, starting in the new year in January, started being, oh well, this is actually kind of more serious. And then when the first cases showed up in the U.S., I was reading the news and listening to the news, and as frightened as anyone else. And I was, it by late February and early March, when it was really taking off in the U.S., I was washing my groceries and sharing the link to that, scolding my mother for not washing the groceries, and it's because I took it really seriously. I was reading everything I could about it, and one thing that was unclear early on was like, what was the real fatality rate of this disease?
Right.
And it's clear that the case fatality rate is not the same as the real fatality rate. The real fatality rate is the infection fatality rate. And because if there's any asymptomatic cases of a disease, then the only way you can find out the real infection fatality rate is to do sampling of, entire populations. And so by early March, that the beginnings of kind of hints of studies that had done that were coming out of Iceland. Iceland did the first sort of big sampling of its population, and they found that there were lots of asymptomatic cases. And so they realized that that study showed that the infection fatality rate was much lower than we thought. At first, they were talking because based on the flawed, made-up projections of Niall Ferguson out of Imperial College, the projections were, as I recall, around 2% infection fatality rate, which is like, it's a lot of people. I remember, calculating the street I live on, being like, how many people are going to die here, and sending an email to friends saying like, this is like, we're talking about like, 2.5 million people are going to die of this in the U.S. But then it became clear from this Iceland study and also observations of the I think it was with the cruise ship that was trapped in Tokyo Harbor. I think it was the Princess, that it was clear that while this is a serious disease, it was not the second coming of the Spanish flu. And I began to relax and think, oh, well, that's good. And then around that time, on March 10th, Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, then mayor of New York, was still saying, if you're 50 years or under and in decent health, you got nothing to worry about. If you get it, it's going to be like the flu. 5 days later, he's closing down the public schools of New York. In that month, in March, New York City builds 4 or 5 field hospitals, and the governor at that time, Andrew Cuomo, leans on Trump to get a bunch of ventilators and also to get one of these military hospital ships sent to the New York harbor. And then by into April, it was clear that these were not being used, and you could sort of tell even before they were all finally closed down that there was just sort of no coverage of this, and there'd be like little hints here and there that there just wasn't that much activity going on in these places. But what happened during March? So that's when I started to rethink all this. I was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And also a colleague of mine whose father is works on avian illnesses as an ornithologist, and my colleague who's the chair of our fantastic heterodox economics program at John Jay, where we have a superb master's program. Little commercial pitch here for the MA program at John Jay, one of the only places you can study economics from a left point of view, worth checking out, heterodox point of view. And this guy trained his undergrad degree was as a pilot, and he flies gliders and stuff like that. And he was just like, from the beginning, he was like, come on, this is an overreaction. And it was like, I was like, really? And I started looking into it, realizing, wow, I think he might be right. And so as I was like looking and seeing these new facts emerge, I could also see that the whole situation was becoming very obviously politicized. So by the end of March, the situation in terms of politicization was that both political parties in the U.S. essentially decided that this was going to be a fight to the death with the pandemic as the weapon. And, to some extent, Trump and the Republicans maybe baited the Democrats into it. In late March, when Trump said, we want to open the economy by Easter, that's the point when the Democratic Party ecosystem went completely bonkers, and they were like, okay, it's on. And the Democratic pundits and consultants and politicians realized correctly, they were like, this time we've got him, right? Hollywood access tape wasn't enough. This, that, the other things weren't enough. This time we've really got him. He's messing up. He's underestimating this. So going into April, the pandemic was thoroughly politicized. It's around that time, too, that you have these DeVos Foundation-funded protests at state capitals. I think it's like at least 32 state capitals saw protests, some of them quite dramatic, with very clearly far-right political actors armed, threatening politicians, that sort of stuff. And so that was red meat to the Democratic Party base and Democratic Party ecosystem. And, it was right around that time in April when the field hospitals started being shut down in New York, and there was no discussion at all. And that was the final straw, when there was no rethink and no public kind of reconsideration. Well, what is this? What's going on here? It's clearly a serious disease, but it's not the Spanish flu. Should we be locking down schools? They're talking about flattening the curve. Well, how long is that going to take? There's no discussion of that because we were off to the races. This was thoroughly politicized. By the end of April, 1.4 million healthcare workers had lost their jobs because in all of these state lockdowns, every single state except for North Dakota had some form of directive to the healthcare sector to suspend elective care. And that's the main moneymaker for hospitals. So a kind of financial crisis was setting in at the same time. So in other words, the government with one hand is actually causing a healthcare crisis. And with the other hand, the CARES Act sets up the Provider Relief Fund, which ultimately has $178 billion in it. That's a quarter of the military budget in 2020. And that money was available to pay 120% of the typical Medicare costs for any case that could be classified as COVID. At first, for a case to qualify as a COVID case, there had to be an in vitro, a lab test proving it was COVID. The rules were changed by the CDC to make it much easier to qualify a case as COVID. A doctor could merely diagnose it from its symptoms, and the case could be covered by these funds from the Provider Relief Care Fund at 120% of the cost. And the money, according to people I've talked to in hospitals, arrived quickly, unlike a lot of reimbursement for the healthcare sector, which arrives slowly. Mm-hmm. So, it was that heading into the tailspin is when I kind of began to come out of my moment of panic. Well, I was there with everybody. And what was so distressing, and is still distressing, is to see how a lot of people got stuck, particularly on the left, got stuck in March 2020. I just went where I live in Western Massachusetts. I just swung by a bakery to try and buy some bread, and it's like, all these kind of young, college educated, hipster types in their, groovy bakery, and they're all like totally masked, and like there's no more masking mandate here, right? These people are like still totally into it. You walk in without a mask, like, sir, you need a mask. It's like pulling my, thing up. I don't have a mask. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So a lot of people just got stuck. A lot of people on the left got stuck in March 2020 and refused to move on because it became like a political fight, because solidarity was weaponized. They were displaying that they were caring for people. And because I think there's some sort of sadomasochistic pleasure that people are taking from submitting to these directives. And also, that's the masochistic part. And the sadistic part is getting to shun and punish and cancel and, demonize the unvaxxed and those who don't care, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, clearly, there's some sort of libidinal connection to this. People get something out of it, along with all of the sort of rational political stuff that they're conscious of. It seems like there's some sort of unconscious pleasure taken in all of this.
Yeah, and what they really weaponized, like the media, is what they weaponize when they try to manufacture consent for U.S. intervention or U.S. invasion in other countries, and that's the Americans' lack of understanding of foreign policy. They preyed on the Americans' lack of understanding of biology or what a lot of these medical terms mean, like infection fatality rate, which from what I know, from what I've seen, there's not a clear definition on what that is. So they would include people that died with COVID with the people that died of COVID. And that's how they would inflate these numbers. And your article, goes into this.
Right.
And one thing that I think needs to be discussed more is how there was already an underlying issue that existed in this country. And that's that a lot of these people who died with COVID or died of COVID already had underlying issues,
Yeah,
autoimmune diseases.
On average, they had 4 pre-existing comorbidities, right? So yeah, I mean, let's be clear. COVID is a real disease, and it has killed lots of people. But what I lay out in the article is not some conspiracy, but I show how, in this moment of panic and chaos, an incentive structure was established. It seems to me rather unconsciously, that very clearly, on the one hand, creates a crisis for the healthcare system. Stop doing hip replacements. Don't do, checkups for people with cancer, or heart problems, whatever. Just skip all that stuff. Financial crisis starts to take hold. And then on the other hand, it's like, and here's a whole bunch of money to subsidize anything that you can call COVID, right? If you're a hospital manager, you would have to be not only some sort of like rule-abiding Boy Scout, you'd have to be kind of a sociopath jerk to be firing your colleagues at the same time that the government is saying, look, Alex Azar, head of Health and Human Services, was saying, our goal is to get the money out the door as quickly as possible. They were just saying, look, we're not about trying to set up bureaucratic hurdles here. Take the money, keep these hospitals open. You'd be out of your mind not to lean into that and, classify every case where there's some sort of, set of symptoms that can look like a COVID diagnosis as a COVID diagnosis. And to be clear, right, this money was available even without a COVID test, right? If a doctor said, well, I think your symptoms add up to COVID, and, the symptoms of COVID could be anything. I mean, shortness of breath, pneumonia. I mean, that's a common feature of heart problems. Liquid can accumulate in the lungs, et cetera, right? So there was a lot of wiggle room. And I think that helps explain why, along with the high rate of pre-existing health problems in this country, but that helps explain why the U.S. has had a 63% higher number of COVID deaths than the next closest OECD economy, right? I mean, our COVID casualties in this country are not only high, they're really, really high compared to other similar economies.
Yeah. Well, I know that if,
And
if like,
and that's important for two reasons. One, because the fear that was stoked by that and created this allegiance to the lockdowns was in response to the whole spectacle of these huge numbers of death, and also because the U.S. is the center of the public health kind of infrastructure globally, right? The World Health Organization, the
yeah,
two largest donors are the U.S. government and the Gates Foundation. So the U.S. doesn't unilaterally dictate public health policy, but it has a really outsized influence on what the rest of the world does. So what happened here had kind of ideological and therefore then also policy reverberations throughout the world.
right. And again, for us, like, and for the audience, if we ourselves don't have an autoimmune disease, we at least know one person close to us who does. And this is the fault in the chemical industry, the food industry, putting all these harmful substances in our food that are so unnecessary. And then as they profit off of this, big pharma profits off of people who have these autoimmune diseases, and then they get these treatments that don't actually cure the disease. And then it's no wonder that these people were so susceptible to getting COVID-19, which in otherwise healthy individuals, they were not at risk, but they had to follow the same procedures as everybody else who was at risk.
Yep. Yeah, it was, and part of what happened during the panic, the never-ending panic, was that there was no cost-benefit analysis allowed, right? And never mind that our society and our economy is constantly doing that in every other realm, and always in medicine, there's a cost-benefit analysis. It's like, well, should you have this treatment or not, right? Because there's a risk to every medical intervention. And so the question is like, you know, will the benefits outweigh the risk, right? And when they do, the answer is let's do it. Let's take that risk, right? But with COVID, it was sort of like, if you even began to say, well, does one size fits all as a policy? Does that really work? I mean, clearly if you, are in your 80s and you've got some comorbidities, yeah, take the vaccine, if it's got, any kind of reasonable safety profile and some chance of being helpful. If you're in the high risk group, go for it. But if you're a young person, who's trying to reproduce, have a family, and you realize, wait a minute, they haven't even studied its effects on reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm healthy, I'm not overweight, I don't have diabetes. It's like, I think I would prefer to take my risks with the disease. That's totally reasonable. You couldn't even begin to have those kinds of conversations without being dismissed as someone who's trying to kill others or as a tinfoil hat wearing lunatic, right? The left just became this totally belligerent, arrogant, mean-spirited, witch hunting, like village of nasty pitchfork wielding peasants, basically. Nothing against the peasantry, very heroic and tenacious class throughout history. They hang on despite the assaults of the free market and states. So maybe a bad analogy. I'm rather a big fan of peasants as a political force and class.
And what about the academic class? I mean, I can say for when I was a student at the time at a university in the biology department, I was surprised by how a lot of the professors were thinking critically about what the media was saying, but then they switched to committing a lot of appeal to authority fallacies when Fauci started speaking more in the media. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I trust him. Like I'm trusting, what the NIH director says. I've worked with the NIH. Like I'm in the DC, Maryland area. These people collaborate a lot with the NIH. So there's a lot of this appeal to authority, unfortunately, within a lot of the academic class. I know you were saying on Max Blumenthal's show and on Jimmy Dore's show that you received a lot of positive feedback with your article. But I'm curious to hear what it was like at the on campus at your university? What was the biology
Well,
department like,
yeah.
um,
Well,
and everybody else as well?
well, my campus is still largely remote. The economics program, I believe, is one of the few that's 100% in person, partly because the chair of our department, guy I was mentioning earlier, was, he's been very good on this, and he's like, this is a dereliction of duty. We are failing our students to try and teach them online. We've got to get back to work. Now, if you have, a reasonable like health excuse, if you got, and we've got colleagues who have health problems. They're not expected to come in. They can teach online, right? I mean, that's fine. But it's like, if you're healthy, you know, uh, get back to work. That's kind of like our position. But a lot of other departments aren't. So it's actually kind of there's not much interaction, right? People are still sort of dispersed, and the place is a little bit. It's not quite empty, but it's still pretty thinly populated. But in terms of the overall culture, a lot of the professors, because they are misinformed, and or because they like working from home and skipping the commute, which I understand. I would really prefer not to have to commute to work. There's a huge downside to that. But the faculty through the union pushed for staying online, and they have really been hyping this up. And the administration has pushed back against that. And we had a vax or test regime. We still have it, and it was actually been the union that has been pushing to remove the testing option. So the union members, primarily the faculty, because the union is both staff and faculty, but primarily led by the faculty, are, in my opinion, totally hysterical. And the union has been captured by a group of ill-informed, arrogant, hysterical people who apparently just listen to NPR and skim New York Times headlines, and they act like it's March 2020. And they think that this has a 2% lethality rate when in fact it doesn't. And they've demanded that the students have a booster, all sorts of outrageous stuff. People have been kicked out of school. Numerous students have been kicked out of school for refusing the vaccine, right? This falls most heavily on young working class women of color at John Jay. When you're talking about kicking people out who refuse to get the vaccine, that's who it mostly is. I'm unvaccinated. I've been in the testing line, and it was like before the hammer came down and all students had to be vaccinated or hit the road, it weighted very heavily female. And, John Jay is working class, like mostly Latino student body. But, like all the City University of New York schools, very diverse student body, but weighted very heavily towards brown working class women, right? And obviously one of their key concerns is like reproductive health, right? My wife, Marcy Smith, because of, the women in her family, these stories were circulating firsthand of people having really bad reactions in the form of menstruation disruption from the vaccine. And Marcy wrote what I think is a very good article for the Gray Zone. I believe it was the first one they did on COVID about this. And then later, we like to think because of her article, but it was because of a number of things. The NIH said, okay, we are going to study this. They studied it. And of course, yes, it's been established. A side effect of these vaccines is menstruation disruption. Now, what does that mean? Like, is menstruation disruption just the symptom of some other problem? We don't know because they haven't studied that. But even if it isn't, it's like, well, if you're a woman trying to get pregnant, that alone is enough to want to postpone or forego this vaccine. If you have determined that you're in good enough health and you realize, well, my chances of getting really sick from this are very, very low, and the authorities haven't even had the consideration to determine what the risks might be to my ability to reproduce, makes perfect sense that young women are going to be like, yeah, I think I'm going to pass on this. And that was The two students in our department that I recall that I know of who were, pressed to the wall by this were women.
I mean, that's part of informed consent. They should have known that. And your article also brings up what happened in the 70s with the swine flu epidemic. And similar to what was happening in 2020, they were
Yeah,
also encouraging people to get vaccinated against the swine flu. And then it turned out to not have even been that bad.
yeah,
And the costs were what outweighed the benefits.
yeah. I think the swine flu of '76 is a really kind of important key to understanding this, because that's really the early beginning of the neoliberal era, right? New
Mm.
York City's fiscal crisis. It's like the crisis of stagflation is underway. It's like the '70s is the crisis moment to which neoliberalism is a reaction. And that's the moment when the kind of the neoliberal shift is beginning. Is austerity is appearing on the horizon, and infectious disease is really on the wane. And that's the moment when you start seeing this really close connection between the regulators and the pharmaceutical industry. And so this is the first time that this pandemic industrial complex sort of kicks into action, where industry and the regulators start hyping up this threat. And 20% of the US population got vaccinated, including President Ford, before it
Mm.
became clear that this swine flu probably didn't kill anyone. The WHO could not identify a single person who was killed by it. The initial casualty was a soldier at Fort Detrick, but it's not really clear what killed this person, whether it was the swine flu or not. Um, and with 20% of the population vaccinated, it started becoming clear that the vaccine was causing Guillain-Barré syndrome and other autoimmune problems, and had killed some people and paralyzed some people, and I think about 300 people, and then about 4,000 people were suing the federal government, and they suspended the vaccination campaign, right? And then through HIV and all the other Zika, dengue, this, that, the other thing, there's been this kind of like attempt to hype up every viral outbreak, every disease as like, this is the big one. We all, the pandemic industrial complex doing this, trying to hype it up. But prior to the moment of Trump derangement syndrome and the election of 2020, the critical capacities of journalists and the political class was intact enough for people at some point to, call nonsense on it. Say, well, what are you guys talking about? Like, it doesn't seem like these threats are as great as the CDC or the, National Institute of Infectious Disease and Allergies are saying. But what happened this time around was it got sucked up into the tornado of Trump derangement syndrome and the election of 2020 and the struggle to get rid of Trump. And at that point, because it was so politicized, that entire class, well, half of the political class, the Democratic Party, politicians, and the kind of punditry, consultancy ecosystem around them, and journalism, which generally is kind of, centrist Democrats, I mean, they all just threw critical thinking out the window and accepted the challenge that this was a fight to the death for the presidency, and as they saw, for the future of America. And so everybody kind of like invested in this politicization of the pandemic. Ultimately, it didn't work out for Trump, right? He said, we're going to open by April. That was the wrong move. And it is part of how he lost the election. And then after the election, the Democrats couldn't let go, because this isn't some sort of like mechanistic conspiracy from on high where it's like, okay, now we go, okay, now we stop. It's like, it's an organic, it is what it appears to be, right? It's like the efforts of political leaders and intellectuals to try and steer public opinion in a certain direction out in the open. And they did that successfully, and it had momentum. And then there was really no like clear way to turn it off. The immediate result is there's this recall campaign against Gavin Newsom. He manages to win. And then the totally the wrong lessons are drawn from that. Newsom comes out and all the pundits say, like, this just shows that people support these tough COVID lockdown policies. And it's not until November of last year, 2021, that a rethink begins. And that was caused by the fact that Governor Phil Murphy, a fairly, by today's standards, a fairly liberal Democrat in New Jersey, almost lost, and that the favored candidate for the Democrats in Virginia did lose, and Youngkin, who comes in out of the blue, and there's like an almost 20-point swing from the Democrats to the Republicans, and the columnists and tweeters of the world generally cast Youngkin's victory in Virginia as if this was all a bunch of racist suburban whites who were freaked out about critical race theory, but post-election focus groups and other research revealed that it wasn't really that. That might have been an issue in it, but a much bigger issue was the anger of parents, particularly mothers, about the heavy-handed and totally unscientific school lockdowns in Virginia. Virginia had some of the longest and harshest school closures. Playgrounds were closed in Virginia. Mothers were arrested for cutting the police tape and having their kids play in empty playgrounds, right? And so that's what helped really drive the swing to Youngkin. And Youngkin was out there, his closing argument on Fox, an editorial on the Fox News page, was all about saying, look, our kids are being harmed, and he gives the numbers, and it's just like lays it out in black and white. This was damaging kids. And he's like, I'm going to end that. I mean, come on. You're a parent of a couple kids. You've been trying to work from home for 2 years. Your kids can't even go to a playground. That's like real material harm happening in real time. And I remember discussing this with friends of mine, even very intelligent friends. And they're like, well, no, the issue is that the Democrats never do anything for anybody. It's like, yeah, but that's always the case. The Democrats always fail to deliver. But this time around, the Democrats were doing more than that. They were doing harm to people. And people got really pissed off about it. And, they voted Republican. And more of that is going to happen in the midterm. And I mean, I would bet dollars to donuts that the Republican, no matter who the Democrat is in 2024, the Republican is going to win.
Yeah.
I hope I'm wrong, but
it always disappoints me too how Americans don't remember their history. Like that incident with what happened in 1976 with the swine flu. There's so many similarities there, and I just want to share this clip for people who may not have seen this before on 60 Minutes, and Dr. Parenti does link this in his article. And I want people to see the similarities here, and then we can get some more of your commentary about this.
The flu season is upon us. Which type will we worry about this year? And what kind of shots will we be told to take? Remember the swine flu scare of 1976? That was the year the U.S. government told us all that swine flu could turn out to be a killer that could spread across the nation. And Washington decided that every man, woman, and child in the nation should get a shot to prevent a nationwide outbreak, a pandemic. Well, 46 million of us obediently took the shot. And now 4,000 Americans are claiming damages from Uncle Sam amounting to $3.5 billion because of what happened when they took that shot. By far the greatest number of the claims, 2/3 of them, are for neurological damage or even death, allegedly triggered by the flu shot. We pick up the story back in 1976 when the threat posed by the swine flu virus seemed very real indeed.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States, as well as 20 million deaths around the world.
See how easy it is to
Thus, the U.S. government's publicity machine was cranked into action to urge all America to protect itself against the swine flu menace.
Influenza is serious business. During major flu epidemics, millions of people are sick and thousands die. Well, this year you can get protection. The vaccines are safe, easy to take, and they can protect you against flu. So roll up your sleeve. Protect yourself.
One of those who did roll up her sleeve was Judy Roberts. She was perfectly healthy, an active woman, when in November of 1976, she took her shot. 2 weeks later, she says, she began to feel a numbness starting up her legs.
I joked about it at that time. I said I'll be numb to the knees by Friday if this keeps up. By the following week, I was totally paralyzed.
So completely paralyzed, in fact, that they had to operate on her to enable her to breathe. And for 6 months, Judy Roberts was a quadriplegic. The diagnosis? A neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS for short. These neurological diseases are little understood. They affect people in different ways. As you can see in these home movies taken by a friend, Judy Roberts' paralysis confined her mostly to a wheelchair for over a year. But this disease can even kill. Indeed, there are 300 claims now pending from the families of GBS victims who died, allegedly as a result of the swine flu shot. In other GBS victims, the crippling effects diminish and all but disappear. But for Judy Roberts, progress back to good health has been painful and partial.
Now, I noticed that your smile, Judy, is a little bit constricted.
Yes, it is.
Is it different from what it used to be?
Very different. I have a greatly decreased mobility in my lips, and I can't drink through a straw.
So she explains her symptoms, and then they ask her, why did you take this? And she said she thought she was doing the right thing. Many people who took the COVID-19 vaccines thought they were doing the right thing. Many people did lose loved ones who took the vaccine. Many people had other adverse effects, myocarditis, and a lot of young people. You shared a tweet on your article by someone named Katie Stoll saying that this disrupted her menstruation cycle, and she's not trying to come out anti-vax in any way, but the lockdown leftists come in and demonize people like this and call them anti-vax anyway. But yeah, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, it's great that you played that. It really, it's a powerful story from 60 Minutes. That's the father of Chris Wallace, by the way, who recently left Fox for CNN. Yeah, I mean, 5 Scandinavian countries banned the use of the Moderna shot because they determined that the risk of myocarditis was greater, caused by the vaccine, was greater than the risk of the vaccine, of the disease. And, the myocarditis in this country is finally acknowledged, but it's dismissed. It's treated. I mean, in talking to my union rep, she emailing with her, she dismissed it. She said, "Well, my understanding is that's a passing phenomena. What people don't know is that, yes, generally myocarditis is a passing phenomena, but then afterwards you have a 20% higher chance of a heart attack. So it's not a mild passing inflammation of the heart. It is that, but then it does seem that there's damage done. So yes, there are clearly risks that go with these vaccines. We don't know what they are because there's such anyone who suggests that is pilloried and calumniated and disparaged. But the VAERS system, which is a government-controlled database, gives a signal that there's an increase in adverse events. Now you can say, well, the age profile of people who have taken these vaccines are older, so they even if they weren't vaccinated, that demographic is going to have a higher rate of sudden death and stroke and whatever else. But the point about VAERS is not that it proves something, but that it's a system for creating signals that should be taken seriously and investigated. And instead, we've had the opposite from the government, from the mainstream press, and from the left to just vehemently attack anyone who suggests there could be any sort of risks. And to suggest that there are risks around this vaccine is not to say they are ipso facto bad, you should never take them. That's not true, right? If, my position at least is that when my mother got the vaccine, I was relieved and she was relieved. My mother is in her mid 80s and, that's great. When, the younger women in my family who want to have children or more children didn't want to get the vaccine because of the menstruation disruption and the total lack of research into its effects on reproduction. They did study its effects on pregnancy, but not on fertility prior to pregnancy. that's also totally reasonable. And what has happened is you're not allowed to have a cost benefit analysis, right? And we do cost benefit analysis constantly in this society, and all medicine is based on that. You you know every medical procedure involves some slight risk, and some medical procedures involve rather significant risks, right? But you undertake them because you have determined that the benefits will outweigh the risks, right? If you get a knee replacement, one of my best friends got a knee replacement, right? You get a knee replacement, I mean, you risk infection, you risk your life, right? But if you're, only 50 years old and one of your knees is blown out, your quality of life is going to be pretty bad, and your health is going to deteriorate if you can't get exercise, right? So it's like, he did a cost benefit analysis, like, hey, I'm gonna take the risk. I would too if I were in that situation, But then around COVID and these vaccines, it was like, if you suggested that, different portions of the population, different demographic segments might have different, choose different paths on this, you were trying to kill people. You were basically some sort of traitor. And so that was, just like everybody was trying to shut down discussion.
Right.
And that's where we still are. We're still at that place by and large, it seems to me, even though luckily, states are beginning to pull back on their mask mandates and school closures. But unfortunately, a lot of the left is like dead enders, not all the left, not the rank and file, but sort of like, the leading voices in organizations too often have gotten stuck in these very bad positions. And just to repeat, I understand how that started. I was there too. But the problem was that people not only didn't engage in a rethink, they were totally hostile to the information that would be useful for such a rethink, and totally hostile and snide and arrogant and dismissive towards anyone who attempted to do so publicly. And in the process, speaking of all the emails I've gotten, in the process, a lot of people have been alienated from the left, and I'm very worried about that.
Yeah. So, what's your outlook? Because on one hand, we do have these arrogant, dogmatic leftists who are still, like you've been describing so well, are stuck in March 2020. They're not open to looking at new information. They're not open to conversations with a lot of their colleagues who are also leftists or describe themselves as leftists. But we also have a good handful of journalists that come from the left that either woke up at some point in 2020 or 2021, and people who listen to these people. We also have like some libertarians, etc., and the people that have sent you positive feedback to your email. Where do you see all of this going? Because I think that a lot of authority figures have seen what kind of policies they can get away with to satisfy their donors. Where do you see this all going?
It's hard to say, and I'm not good at predicting the future, but I have been heartened by the response. And I think that, people, on the left who kept quiet because they were basically just hoping that each wave was the last one, that's part of it too. Everyone's just like, all right, this is totally nuts, but it'll be over soon, right? And then it starts again. But the people are, not. I think a lot of people on the left are done, right? And they're ready to be called crazy, tinfoil happy, and they're just done. They realize this is self-destructive, this is insane, and there's got to be a course correction, and they're going to do it. And so if there is Fauci today was talking about, or maybe it was yesterday, talking about how masks might come back, and there could be another wave, and there probably will be another wave, But I think that a sizable number of people are done with this, and they're going to start coming out of the shadows and saying like, hey, man, I went along with this. I did my part. I'm not going to be part of the vigilante squad that goes after the unvaxxed. This is nonsense. and it's worse than nonsense. It's quite destructive for the left's cause, and it's destructive for the left's cause because it divides the working class, and it has done so during the tightest labor market in 40 years, when all our efforts as left intellectuals should be about uniting people, uniting the working class, supporting the working class to fight against bosses for better wages and better working conditions and more freedom. And, speaking of freedom, it's very important. I mean, the way that the left has embraced censorship, I mean, something I get into in the article, I mean, it's unbelievable. Some of the most intelligent people I've known for years, I mean, they say that what I consider to be the craziest stuff I've heard. They're like, well, the Joe Rogan case, that's an interesting case. It's not censorship. It's an interesting case. It's like, what are you talking about? Spotify took down 20,000 podcasts, according to Spotify, right? I mean, and what I say in the article is like, well, if you don't want to call it censorship because it's not the government doing it, that doesn't matter. You can call it whatever you want. It's still wrong. It's still capital dominating the intellectual life of the society, dominating the intellectual life of the working class, and preventing people making connections and coming up with critical ideas. I call that censorship, and I call that a kind of intellectual tyranny. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't change what's happening, right? People have embraced this censorship. They have rejected liberty. And this, I think, is very important, is that liberty, freedom is not one of the things the left has done historically. It's not an add-on, it's not one of the flavors that we offer. It has been central to the left project, right? Human emancipation, the freedom of the individual, that is at the heart of what the Enlightenment promised. The left, kind of socialist, anarchist, communist, Marxist, social democratic critique of this, the mainstream of the Enlightenment was that they failed to deliver. That mainstream liberalism failed to deliver on the promises, the emancipatory promises of the Enlightenment. And then what was needed was an economic revolution to deliver on the promise of these rights. The revolution of rights, was incomplete without an economic revolution. So, human freedom, the autonomy of the individual was central, is at the heart of that whole project. The reason socialists for the last 150 years have wanted a more egalitarian society and have wanted to eradicate poverty and exploitation was because those are the preconditions for human freedom and autonomy of the individual, right? So to toss aside the liberty agenda, the freedom issue is no minor thing. That is to do damage. That is to mutilate the heart of the left tradition. So I think we need to really think more seriously about all of that, And I mean, this is I think a very, very disturbing thing. And there's a bit of a generational split here. I'm of a generation where I came of age before there was really much of a left rejection of civil liberties, but now that's become quite prominent. I know of some young leftists who, well, my wife, when she ran a nonprofit, and she wanted to make, it was a climate change related nonprofit. It's a long story. It'd be worth interviewing her about that sometime. And she wanted to put civil liberties on the agenda, and one of her young kind of foundation funded lefty, collegiate lefty deranged colleagues said to her just right out in front of everybody at a meeting, she said, well, civil liberties, that's kind of a right-wing issue. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. What? Like somebody who goes around trying to out-left everybody and who's his a paid activist would say that, what? And that reveals, among other things, a total lack of familiarity with the history of the First Amendment, right? First of all, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, are themselves a concession to the people. The Constitution is, written up and it has to be ratified by 9 of the 13 new states. And the document's passing around, and people are saying, whoa, the government that this document creates is very, very powerful. And there doesn't seem to be much protection for individuals, and by extension, the social movements that they might be part of, to oppose the government or to oppose other powerful interests in the society. We're not sure we want to ratify this. And so the only way the Constitution could be ratified was for there to be a deal that said, as soon as it's ratified, we're going to pass the new government that this Constitution creates will immediately pass 10 amendments protecting all these individual rights. And that's the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, right? So that's concession number one at the very outset of the Republic. Then the First Amendment isn't national law. It's treated as federal law for, almost, like 140 years, 130 years. It's treated as federal law. So you have a constitutional right to free speech and assembly on federal property, but not on state property, not in state realm. And so the struggle to, as it said, nationalize the First Amendment was led by leftists. All the key cases are lefties, that Gitlow versus New York, I think, is the case that finally establishes it. It's some guy named Gitlow who's written something called the Left Wing Manifesto that's being censored, and so that nationalizes free speech. Getting like symbols included as speech, that case is championed by a young communist named Jetta Stromberg, who's arrested for flying a red flag during a labor protest in California, and she goes all the way to the Supreme Court and establishes that political symbols are also speech. The left pioneered all of this. Now there's here and there are important cases where the right was championing were the plaintiffs, but the vast majority of the legal struggle to make civil liberties real was the left did that, and now the left has abandoned all that, and that's bad.
Yeah, and they're also ignoring a lot of issues. And your article goes into great detail about the Global South's reaction to COVID and the measures that they took with lockdowns. And I talked about this briefly with someone from the Great Barrington Declaration, but you go into it with a lot more depth in your article, the damage that was done and how a lot of these leftists that champion themselves to be standing with the Global South against Western tyranny, they were silent about that. So what can you tell us about the damage that was done in the Global South when they took these lockdown measures that were truly unnecessary from what it looks like?
Yeah. I mean, there's the economic damage, first of all. So, coming out of the 2008 crisis, the kind of macroeconomic position of developing economies have been slowly but surely improving, right? Lowering their debt burden, increasing their public spending, and then that positive trend line, that's totally arrested and reversed because of the precipitous downturn that happens with the initial lockdowns. I think that the U.S. economy contracts by something like 23% or something like that in the second quarter, the first quarter of 2020, right? So it's really unprecedented historical drop, right? So that then causes economic whiplash throughout the Global South, and debt expands radically. All of these countries, there's remittances coming from the Global North, which is an enormous source of tax revenue and income for people in many developing economies. For example, in El Salvador, for decades, the single largest source of tax for the government, it's either like the export tax on coffee or the import tax on remittances that are sent down to El Salvador by Salvadorians living abroad, mostly in the U.S., right? So remittances, sending money to the family back home, this is a huge part of how economies in developing economies in the Global South have been growing. People then back home spend it, it becomes economic stimulus, they invest it, they start businesses, et cetera. So remittances take a real hit. Governments have to impose austerity, debt goes up. And so the debt burden increases. The numbers off the top of my head, I should open the piece, but it's we're talking I think it's something like 270 million people are expected to have been plunged into poverty by this. So the macroeconomic outcomes are terrible. In terms of then directly moving from the economic to the sort of political, many countries in the global south impose really draconian, brutal lockdowns. 80,000 people are arrested in the Dominican Republic for violating quarantine. 40,000 people arrested in Guatemala. 8,000 people in Paraguay do long-term time in jail for violating the curfew. In Jordan, the teachers union had been in the middle of a campaign to increase wages. That union is raided, it's crushed, its members are jailed, and it's dissolved. It's like the union is destroyed because it was continuing its protest efforts and violating COVID safety rules. The kind of continuing anti-austerity movement in Iraq is repressed. Throughout East Asia, there are numerous social movements that are repressed harshly in the name of apolitical public safety COVID restrictions, right? So all across the global south, there's a wave of unprecedented repression. This also, I relied heavily on the Amnesty International report for 2020, 2021. Also, what goes on, which doesn't actually show up that much in the Amnesty report, but I've heard from people who lived in places that were undergoing this. The police, like in Colombia, for example, the guy I know lived in Colombia in Medellin during the lockdown, and it's like the COVID lockdown was a license to go around for police, a license to basically just terrorize and shake down anyone that they found on the street, right? So it becomes like open season for corrupt and brutal police throughout the global south, on and on and on. And there's very little attention paid to that, and none of that made any scientific sense. It's like, way to fight a disease. People who are violating curfew, quarantine, and this generally falls not on the middle class, but on the poorest of the poor, who, like, if you don't work that day, you don't eat that day, right? And so, like, these people have to go out to the dump and collect recyclables and have to try and, hustle up work however they can. And so then they get arrested and thrown in jail, overcrowded jails, where, of course, they're more likely to get COVID and other diseases. So every power structure, every hierarchy across the planet, from street gangs to governments to universities to businesses, they have all grabbed this opportunity to impose repressive control and get rid of accountability. And you see that everywhere. I mean, the excuses are unbelievable. I was just reading yesterday an article in the Washington Post about the Congressional Ethics Committee. And it's like, what they've been mostly concerned with, why they haven't made much progress on congressional corruption over the last 2 years? Because they're busy investigating mask rule violations. That's most of what they've done for the last 2 years. Isn't that convenient? Because they certainly don't want to investigate corruption because they're all so corrupt. On and on and on. Everyone is using this as an excuse to, to not do the important and good things that they're supposed to be doing, and to just lean into the corrupt, corner cutting things that they can get away with.
Yeah. Kristen Parenti, I could go on and on about all the information that you provided in your article. It's really, really in depth. It's cited. There's footnotes in that article. There are a lot of information there about.
That was very nice of Max to do. Also, we got to have footnotes. This can't be linked. People will dismiss the link. We got to we have to show them the sourcing. Sorry to interrupt. Go on.
Yeah. No, it's. I was just gonna say, the biggest elephant in the room to me is how there was absolutely no point in the vaccines if people could still get sick from it. Evidence from Public Health Scotland, from the UK, from Israel, showing how there is virtually, in some situations, more people got sick when they were double dosed or triple dosed.
And now Rochelle Walensky came out August 5th of last year and said, they don't, the vaccines help diminish hospitalization and death, but they don't stop transmission. So it's like, well, okay, well, wait a minute. That means that these are then individual treatments, and there is no logic. There's no like herd immunity to be achieved through vaccination, and that's a huge part of what has driven the lockdown left. They're like, if everybody would just get vaccinated, this would go away. But that's not true, because these are non-sterilizing vaccines. So we can't vaccinate this disease into extinction. It's going to be here with us.
Right, right. And plenty of scientific studies are showing that. A study from the Lancet showed that someone who is vaccinated can still transmit the disease just as much as somebody who's unvaccinated, though their own chances of getting sick are slightly reduced. But I mean, the rate at which they can transmit it doesn't change. You can still get it from from a vaccinated person or an unvaccinated person.
The viral load of vaccinated people who get sick is the same as unvaccinated people who get sick. Yeah. And we don't know. I mean, the CDC, it should be said, refuses to release the hospitalization rates by vaccination status and age for people below, I think it's age 50. The New York Times article, February 22nd or 23rd. You can look that up. I don't footnote it, but I mentioned it in the piece. I mean, it's like, that's pretty fishy, right? So it's like, I mean, we know, or it seems that the vaccines do diminish death and hospitalization for the elderly. That's the information the CDC is releasing. They won't release similar types of information about people under age 50. Why is that? Well, they say because they're afraid it might be misinterpreted. What does that mean?
Right. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But yeah, is there any other information you want to get out there for the audience that you feel is really important before we close off here?
Well, let's just, I think one thing that is sort of so obvious to me that I forgot to put it in there is the profiteering that's at the heart of this, right? Pfizer made $22 billion in profit last year. Their business doubled in size almost, right? 22 billion, that's the size of the Cambodian economy. That's a lot of money for profit. So let's not forget that that's really central to this tremendous bonanza for these pharmaceutical companies and for everyone in the asset owning class who has invested in them, right? Yeah. So that's really central. That's the heart of it. This kind of, hidden in plain sight conspiracy of the owners of these stocks, making out like gangbusters from all this.
Yeah, which they can sit in board meetings at for the FDA and the WHO, and I mean they can have an influence there in those meetings to profit more, like you said. All right, Christian Parenti, thank you very much. It's truly, again, it's an honor to have you on. It's an amazing article. Where else can people find your work?
If you just Google my name, things will come up. The article I wrote prior to this, most recent article, is called The First Privilege Walk. That's at non-site. But just, Google my name in parentheses, and, my books and my articles should pop up. And, people can, I have a faculty webpage at John Jay. People can look at some of the stuff I've written there. And I would encourage people, anyone who's interested in studying, getting a master's degree in political economy, please come, check out the John Jay program.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you guys so much for watching. You're not alone, and I know you'll stay informed. Thank you very much, Christian Parenti.